Good morning. Welcome to the Association of Lifelong Learners and our presentation on adverse childhood experiences. We have today with us Mary Schalk. Mary is the program director for Partners in Prevention and began her career in this organization as a volunteer in 1993 with Maggie Clay, who many of us know. She now plans and provides training programs in Alpena, Alcona, Montmorency, and Presque Isle counties on the effects of adverse child experiences on children and adults as well, and on fetal alcohol syndrome and suicide prevention and intervention programs. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. So this is really important information. You may have heard bits about it in the public, but we're going to take a little bit deeper dive today in trying to understand. And we're going to be not only looking at the adverse childhood experiences, but the broader category of near science. So it is the intersection of neuroscience, epigenetics, adverse childhood experiences, and resilience. So the ACE study, I'm going to tip this down a bit, just so I'm looking at all of you and not just at the screen, has produced what has really been called the most significant public health findings of our time. Stop and think about that. Yes, this is that significant to us and to our children and to our communities. And we're also connecting the brain research and social study sciences, and that together is really leading to a very powerful scientific discovery. In Michigan, there is a Michigan ACEs initiative that's really working to try to spread this information throughout all professions, throughout the community, so that we really understand what it means and how we can make a difference in understanding this information. So this began with what we call the ACE study. It really confirmed with scientific evidence this notion that what happens to us in early childhood has an impact on us throughout our lifetime, including our medical, physical health, as well as mental health, and a lot of problems that we could experience. This was the largest study of its kind. It was done in the early 1990s. And we see here Dr. Robert Anda and Dr. Vincent Felitti, who were the co-principal investigators of this study. We've been fortunate to have them come to Michigan several times. And Dr. Anda especially has been involved in what we now call the ACE interface and has developed the information that we're looking at. So we're going to start with, let me go back. We're going to start with the neuroscience part of this, brain development. You know, it's our human nervous system that connects us to ourselves, to other people, and to the whole world around us. The central nervous system, consisting of the brain and the spinal cord, it integrates all that information that's coming in through all of our senses. We have receptors all over our body that are taking information in all the time. It regulates things like our internal body functions, like regulating our temperature, our heartbeat. It also manages this really elaborate chemical and electrical signaling all throughout our bodies. So the nervous system, as it takes into consideration that sensory input, is determining what to do with that information each and every second, almost instantaneously. It's interpreting what that sensory input means and how we need to use that information to respond to the world around us. Those cells in our nervous system that are called neurons, they're stunningly effective at processing and transmitting information. And it really has one purpose in doing so. It's to help keep us alive. So at birth, we have, you know, all these neurons in our system. On the left side of this graphic, you see, you know, what those may look like. And all those neurons are there. They don't have a lot of connections at that point. That's really where the brain growth comes from, and building those connections with other brain cells. You know, babies are only born with the connections that they need at that point. You know, they need to breathe. They need to regulate body temperature. They need to be able to connect with whoever is caring for them. They don't need to solve math problems. They don't have to plan into the future. Those parts of the brains aren't developed yet. But by age 6, in that graphic in the center, we see how those same neurons have many more connections. Those connections are developed by the experiences we have. Those connections are absolutely experience dependent. If we're deprived of experiences, we don't get those connections. Our brain isn't wiring in the proper way. Those neurons aren't learning to communicate with each other in the way that makes them the most efficient and the most effective. So what gets experienced the most is what tends to have more robust connections between those neurons. What gets repeated is really what gets wired most strongly. So we go through that process that we call branching as those neurons are reaching out to other neurons and making those connections. In the graphic on the right, we see what happens somewhere around the age of 14. Those same neurons are still there, but you can see they may have fewer connections that they did in those younger elementary ages. We call that process pruning, as those connections that are not used so much are pulled back. They aren't needed if they aren't being used. So those least experienced connections are the ones that withdraw, where the most experienced connections are the ones that are made stronger. So that begins to help us understand why neglect or not getting the experiences we need can have such a powerful effect on our ongoing health and our development as we grow. So we're going to imagine, what life is like as we're growing up. Certainly everybody's experiences are unique. Everybody's life is unique, but we're going to simplify it for this illustration and just boil it down to 2 experiences, 2 worlds. One that is rather mean and dangerous, as illustrated by the pathway we see here on the top, and one that's much more benevolent and kind and generous. So when we're having traumatic experiences during development, like abuse, like neglect, like chaotic living situations, chaotic households, that generates a predictable pattern of how our brain is going to build, and then patterns of behavior and traits that we develop. We're only made to be under stress for about 20 minutes. We can tolerate that. But when we're experiencing stress for longer periods, it really changes our brain in how it prepares for what we're going to be facing. Those short-term stressors are giving us enough time to know, are we going to stand up and fight for ourselves? Or are we going to hide? But when that stress is ongoing, when those stress chemicals are produced continuously through experiences like child abuse or neglect, our bodies tend to prepare for living in a very dangerous world. We don't have those periods of stress and calm. And there's so much more stress. We are preparing ourselves for fighting danger at any given time. So those stress hormones exert a lot of influence on our cells and on the chemicals in our brain and how our brains are wiring. They sculpt brains that are wired for certain characteristics, like being edgy or hot-tempered, always on alert, hypervigilant. Or we can go the other way to where we're withdrawn or dissociated or feeling numb. So that's the path that we see outlined at the top of this slide. People who have had traumatic stress from conception to the toddler years have a higher baseline of stress hormones like cortisol in their bodies. So those people tend to be more edgy, have a short fuse, be self-focused. They may have a hard time shifting gears from being in high emotional levels to problem solving. We would like to think our stress levels are down here somewhere. But when they're up here on a regular basis, it doesn't take much for that to boil over when another stress comes along. They're prepared for expecting that there's another danger around the corner. They're not able to really focus on other people, on others' emotions, being able to problem solve, to think through. They're just ready for what's the next danger that's coming. But the downside, that's good, right? That we're wired to protect ourselves. That's there for a purpose. That's important for our survival. But when those stress hormones like cortisol hang around for a long time, they become toxic to brain cells. That toxicity includes making it difficult for the brain cells to develop healthy networks, and it can cause brain cells to die. So when we call continuous stress, trauma, and episodic and unpredictable stress toxic stress, that's really an apt phrase to describe what's going on. So Dr. Martin Teicher of Harvard University, who's a leading brain researcher, calls this lower path in the diagram the benevolent world path. Its world is kind, it's easygoing, it's helpful, it's free from a lot of traumatic stress. People growing on this path are more likely to develop a brain with cells and wiring chemistry for being focused, for being flexible, to be oriented toward relationships and people. So it's kind of a common belief in our society that the people whose experiences take them on that top path are maladaptive, and the people on the benevolent path are adaptive. But that's not true. Both pathways are adaptive. Both brains are adapting to the experiences that they're having. So can you imagine that the people who grow up in this more chaotic path have characteristics that are really helpful for certain situations? What might be a good match for somebody who tends to be edgy and hypervigilant, emotionally detached, who's quick to act? Our graphic shows that, right? If you're having somebody who's a first responder, do you want someone who takes time to sit back and consider what to do and thinks through and plans very carefully? No, you want somebody who can jump in, who can act, who's not so emotionally attached that they get caught up in what's happening with this person and then they can't react appropriately. So there are positives there. We need those kinds of folks who can just jump in and act. And adaptation is good for us as a species. If you've grown up in that world, you're more likely to be able to survive when things are tough, when those big stressors come along. You've practiced that. Your brain is wired to know how to react to those situations. People whose brains are adapt to a safe world, they're more likely to meet society's expectations when times are peaceful, when things are going smoothly, when things are happening in the way we think we might like. Those experiences really get wired into our biology. But Dr. Teicher kind of describes this as, we run into trouble when our biology collides with social expectations. If you put a person from the benevolent world into a chaotic or turbulent environment, say in police work where they're involved in riot control, that person's really going to struggle until they've learned some very specific skills about how to react in that situation. So in the same way, you think about a child who is adapted to a dangerous and a stressful world, it may be difficult for them to be patient. They may not share. Learning, they haven't learned so well to cooperate. They may not use words as a first choice when they're reacting to a situation. So imagine when a child comes to school and we ask them to sit and to be still and to share and to cooperate. That's not how their brain is wired. That can be a really painful disconnect, not only for the child, but the adults in the classroom who have these expectations that don't match with the adaptation this child has learned. So that child too will need to be taught specific skills on how to manage in this world. That is not what they're built for. Just as if we would have to train somebody who's grown up in a benevolent world to know how to react appropriately when there's a chaotic situation. So one of the things that's important for us to keep in mind is the age that someone is when they experience maltreatment. We know that our brains develop in a very predictable sequence from those most primitive areas that control our breathing and our body temperature to the more advanced parts of our brain that deal with problem solving and planning and organizing, all those executive skills. You know, a tiny baby doesn't need to be able to write a paper or pass a math test. They do need to breathe and eat and regulate body temperature. They need to sleep. They need to connect with somebody who's going to nurture and protect them. So those parts of the brain that control that internal body functioning and that ability to connect are the first things that develop. The brain regions that control complex thought processes like abstract writing and math aren't developed until later in childhood. And those final executive functionings aren't fully developed until we're in our middle 20s. Sometimes I remember attending a workshop led by Pat Crum, and the title of her workshop was Teens, What Are They Thinking? And the first thing she said is, they aren't. You know, they're not thinking like adults because their brains aren't fully developed yet. Some of us, it takes a little longer, right, to really develop that good judgment. But as our brain's development, there are sensitive periods for each brain region when the size and functional abilities of that region are most affected by stress. New abilities are built and grow on the development from earlier months and years. So you can imagine if we have a shaky foundation, everything that comes later is not as sturdy and as robust as we would like it to. So over time, we have these elaborate systems of specialized brain regions that just really help us know how to navigate in an increasingly complicated world and the environment around us. So we know that toxic stress in early childhood has profound effects on brain structures and functions. And again, those are the foundations for what comes and grows and develops later. Functions that include the mediation of emotional responses, social interactions, abstract thinking. So when we say that, you know, early childhood is so important, it really is. Those experiences are critically important. But early child isn't the only period of time when we have those sensitive developmental periods. You know, the latest research continues to back that up. Each brain region has its own sensitive periods of time. For example, during middle childhood, somewhere around ages 7 to 13, emotional and verbal abuses can affect the centers for processing sound, developing verbal language, and perceiving social cues. So let me say that again. Emotional and verbal abuse during those middle childhood years affect the centers for processing sound, developing verbal language, and perceiving social cues. So that development has started early, but that's a really critical time for those skills to develop. By the mid to late 20s, our central nervous system with our brain as the command center orchestrates everything from our automatic body functions like breathing and heartbeat to complex goal-oriented behavior, and to be able to think in an abstract analytical way. And those elaborate signaling systems in our brain by that time have become pretty well practiced if they've had the proper experiences. So in a fraction of a second, our central nervous system is determining whether this input we're taking from our, sight, sound, touch, all of those senses we're familiar with, and whether they should come into the brain and be processed, or whether the information is filtered out because it isn't necessary for us to really be focusing and paying attention to it. Stress can be interpreted as something we can tolerate and work through, or it can become something that's really completely overwhelming. And our set points for how we deal with that stress is set by early adulthood because of our experiences throughout childhood. So again, is your stress baseline down here so that, you can have a negative experience and it's stressful, but you can manage because you've still got room, or your stress level's up here so that the next difficult thing really pushes you over the edge. There's good news though, always in this, that we do have a collective choice. There are things we can do to impact this in a positive way. We've talked about those sensitive developmental periods when toxic stress has that really profound effect on development. But in childhood, there are also plenty of windows of opportunity for building resilience, for developing, a brain that's sensitive to all kinds of experiences, the positive and those that are more challenging. So when we're paying attention to those sensitive developmental periods, we can do a better job of protecting our children from the things that are harmful, that have that negative impact on their brain development. We want to provide them with challenges and support them through those challenges. It's not that we want to protect our children from everything. They need to have those challenging experiences, but a huge factor in that is whether or not they have, a caring, competent adult who can help them make sense of what's going on around them and know how to respond in a helpful and an appropriate way. So that collective choice we have is we can develop skills and make accommodations that enable, everyone to be able to contribute, including people that have been raised in a situation, in an environment where they have learned to be on guard, to protect themselves. We can value and appreciate what they bring to all of us together as well. We kind of have this pattern of rejecting people that have had those negative experiences and that tend to react in ways that we consider not acceptable. But we can also look at that and say, I understand why they have that approach. I understand why they react in that way, and help them see perhaps another way, a way that is more beneficial, more appropriate, but also appreciate those skills that they have that are also needed. So if you don't remember anything else about today, remember this one thing, that toxic stress can be hardwired into our biology. It may look like people are making a choice to respond to things in a negative way, but that's the way they have grown and developed, and it's not a conscious choice. So before we assume that a person's behaviors are rebellious, that they're intentionally breaking rules, we might want to consider whether adversity in childhood is a cause of what we're seeing. So as we mentioned earlier, the near science, the E part of that is epigenetics. And epigenetics is a fairly new field of science that explains how our genes respond, how our genes are turned on and turned off with signaling. Genes are contained in the DNA of our cells. It provides the instructions for our cells to become specialized into liver cells or heart cells or whatever their purpose is going to be in our body. It also contains keys to disease and well-being throughout our life course. So epigenetics tells us about the ways that the instructions on our genes get used. So to understand epigenetics, it's important to understand a bit about how DNA is organized. So imagine you have some fishing line, a lot of fishing line, like many, many yards of fishing line. Do you need to do something to help it keep organized? Absolutely. If you didn't put it on a reel and keep it nice and tight, what would happen to it? It would become this tangled mess that suddenly wasn't useful for anyone. So when you're putting out the line, bringing in the line, you're keeping kind of control of it by use of that reel, so that it can stay organized, so it can be useful to do its job. Kind of in a similar way, we have thousands of genes, and our long strands of DNA are tightly condensed in the chromosomes in the nucleus of our cells. Now, our reel of fishing line is very visual. It's very concrete. We can see that. We can't so well see the DNA in our cells because of its tiny size. But if we were able to look at it closely, like the fishing line on a reel, the DNA is tightly wrapped around protein balls called histones. So epigenetics involves the attachment of chemicals And you see that here by this kind of orange cylinder in our diagram, to the DNA at a particular gene. This attachment of that chemical can prevent the gene's message from being available to read. Other types of chemical attachments can cause a gene to be open, so instructions can be read by the cell. So they're almost like little switches in saying what part of that DNA is going to be available to be read and which is closed off and not able to be read. So here's where it becomes relevant to ACEs. The new research suggests that stressful experiences can influence these chemical attachments that influence the reading of our genetic code. And in that way, it can have a negative effect on the ways our cells function. This might be an important reason why ACEs are so related to so many health and societal problems. So even at that basic cellular level in our bodies, adverse childhood experiences has an impact. Now, the hopeful part of that is that other types of positive life experiences may also affect the reading of our genes, and that can reverse the negative effects of ACEs, can have positive effects on human development. So how does this attach to our ongoing health? I mean, to me, that's just an amazing discovery to know that those experiences impact us at our cellular level. This isn't just something that's in some strange way affecting our behavior. I mean, this is all biological, even at our cellular level. So the science of epigenetics tells us that the ability of our cells to read the message of our genes is influenced by our experiences. Scientists discovered that responses to stress may be passed from one generation to the next. They conducted this pretty interesting, at least I find it very interesting, research study where they conditioned these rats to be afraid of the smell of cherry blossoms. When the cherry blossom odor came into the rats' environment, they huddled together out of fear until the odor was removed. So then those rats had pups who grew up without any exposure to cherry blossoms. That generation of rats was separated from their parents. They were placed in a different environment, so there wasn't any, teaching going on from the parent rats to the next generation of rats. But when the smell of cherry blossoms was put in their environment, the rat pups were jumpy. They had a heightened sensitivity to the smell of cherry blossoms, even with never having been exposed to the smell of cherry blossoms. So they were able to show that genetically, that fear associated with that scent was transmitted to the next generation. So why might it be a good thing for sensitivity or fear to be passed to another generation? Why might it be a good thing for the rats to feel fear even though no one ever taught them they should fear cherry blossoms? That's for our survival. That's why those things are passed along. Fear can protect a species from dangerous situations or from toxins. It's an important part of how we're made to, give that protection to the next generation. It can be adaptive for fear to be passed from one generation to the next if it can help prevent poisoning or prevent exposure to dangers. So the field of epigenetics may help us understand how groups of people can be deeply affected by historical trauma, despite current efforts to care for one another well. We certainly see these discussions in our community from time to time. How do we heal the wounds of our ancestors? We may not fully know the answer to that, but we know that, we are the ones who are here today and can consider that and think about how do we make a difference. There's nobody else waiting to do that. I wish I knew who I should be attributing to this quote to, but we are the ones we've been waiting for. We're waiting for somebody to take care of it. We are the ones who are here. But let's think again about the positive side of experience being passed from one generation to the next. Scientists are testing whether positive characteristics like nurturing behavior towards each other can be inherited from one parent, from someone's parents and grandparents. The field of epigenetics provides us with hope that our ways of relating to one another can create long-lasting positive change right through that genetic expression. And that's, where ACE interface is looking at groups that they call self-healing communities, and how through our intentional efforts, we can find a way to pass on those positives to the next generations. So the A of neuroscience, the ACEs study, we've kind of been talking around it for a little bit, so now we'll dig a little more into those details. This study was done that really gives us a sense of the impact of adverse childhood experiences on the population as a whole. Epidemiologists are scientists who study the origins of disease, disability, productivity, and health across a population rather than in individuals. They help us to focus our efforts on issues and processes that will make the most difference for the well-being. We think in our community of our public health system, that is their role, to look at the big picture of health and promote those things that we can all be doing. So we're going to talk in more detail about the ACEs study. Again, Dr. Rob Anda and Dr. Vincent Felitti were the co-principal investigators. Most prior studies that were looking at these kinds of societal effects of childhood really focused on a single type of adversity. So there were studies about neglect, there were studies about sexual abuse, but this was the first time there was a study that was looking collectively at a number of different issues. It also kind of broadened our view of what those childhood stressors might be. And then they also looked at the consequences in terms of the bigger picture of health outcomes and more general societal outcomes. It was a unique study because it provided the potential to understand how a number of different forms of childhood experiences, negative childhood experiences, could impact public health. So the design of the study began in 1991, and in 1994, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention funded the study. It was completed by the Department of Preventative Medicine in San Diego, and it studied more than 17,000 people. They were all members of the Kaiser Health Insurance Plan, and each of them completed a survey about their childhood experiences, and then also about health behaviors, disease risks, and disease, mental health and substance use, other health and societal problems, and the people in the study ranged from age 19 to age 94. Participants were generally well-educated. Most had attended college. Only 6% did not have a high school diploma. And at that point of the US population, about 13% had not completed a high school diploma. So these were people who had it easier, better, I won't say easier, but were considered, had some advantages that not everyone had. They were predominantly white, middle-class people, and they had access to some of the best healthcare in the world. Some of those study participants are still being followed today, which is pretty amazing that this study has been ongoing for that long period of time. It's looking at causes of death, incidence of diseases, healthcare utilization, use of prescription medication. So what were some of the findings? Here you see the categories of ACEs that they studied. They fell into three general categories of household dysfunction, and that included substance abuse in the home, parental separation or divorce, mental illness, someone in the home, whether mothers were experienced violence, and then criminal behavior based on whether someone who was a member of the household was incarcerated. They looked at two categories of neglect, both emotional and physical neglect. And then three categories of abuse, emotional, physical, and sexual. As you can see, the numbers represent the number of people who indicated that they had experienced that particular adverse childhood experience. And from that, we can see that they're pretty common in this middle class, well-educated population. So because the ACEs are so highly interrelated, they decided it didn't make sense to look how single categories of ACEs influenced health and social problems. Instead, they developed what they called the ACE score. So as people filled out this questionnaire, and they had these 10 categories that we just looked at, if you had experienced any of those as a child, you marked it as a 1. It didn't matter if it was how severe, how frequent you had experienced that. If you had experienced that as a child, it was marked as a 1. So somebody who experienced physical abuse, had a parent who abused substance, their ACE score was 2. So we think of this as kind of a biological stress dose. And as the ACE score goes up, so does the exposure to the developmental effects of toxic stress. More stress experienced within that household. So you can see from this, only 1/3 of the people said they had no ACEs, had an ACE score of 0. 16% had an ACE score of 4 or more. And there's really nothing magical about 4 and lumping them together from there, just for the ease of illustration. They just chose not to show 4 ACEs, 5 ACEs, 6 ACEs. They just collectively describe them as 4 or more. But we can see that they're common. They tend to cluster. And they're a hidden burden as we look at populations and study what's going on with individuals and the challenges that we face. So people who report a higher ACE score are more likely to have health and social problems. In fact, as the ACE score goes up, so do the problems people experience. So you can see that dose-response relationship. Across the bottom, you see the number of ACEs. Across the vertical axis, the percentage of people with health problems. That was really fascinating to me, that it was not just about mental health challenges or just difficulty with living situations, that it actually impacted physical health as well. So all the data on each of these slides is laid out in the same way. Along the bottom on the horizontal axis are the ACE scores. And then on the vertical axis is the percentage of people who have that disease or condition, whatever we're describing in that particular slide. So in this first set, what you're seeing there on the left, early smoking initiation. We see that the percent of people who became regular cigarette smokers by age 12 goes up as the ACE score goes up. The second set of bars, we see the percent of people who were smokers as adults also goes up in a stepwise fashion as the ACE score goes up. People with higher ACE scores have increased risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. About 4% of people with an ACE score of 0 develop COPD, more than double of that percent, about 9% with an ACE score of 4 or more develop COPD. So how does that happen? We know that ACEs lead to early onset of smoking, which is usually sustained throughout adulthood. When someone starts early, they generally are going to continue smoking. And of course, then that relates to a higher percentage of smoking-related diseases. We know that ACEs can result in depression and anxiety. Nicotine can actually reduce the symptoms of depression and anxiety. So the benefits of reducing those unpleasant emotions, might help us explain why, knowing about the health risks of smoking isn't enough for people to quit. They are getting a benefit. And even though they know, we've done a marvelous job of decreasing smoking rates. People are really well educated about what is the impact of smoking. So people aren't smoking because they don't know the dangers, but they are getting a benefit from smoking. We know that we can begin to anticipate why ACEs are related to certain behaviors and social conditions. So here we're looking at alcohol use. The risk of becoming an alcoholic increases 6 times from an ACE score of 0 to an ACE score of 6. And we know that ACE scores also affect relationships. People with higher ACE scores are more likely to marry an alcoholic. So think for a moment about how those two together tend for ACEs to be transmitted to the next generation. Not only do you have a parent who is an alcoholic, you may have a second parent or an environment that, supports that behavior. One of the things that was surprising to me is to learn that depression is the leading cause of disability in developed countries. That was quite amazing to me. But the risk of depression increases both for men and women in a dose response fashion as the ACE score goes up. So here we see the lighter blue line indicates women, the darker blue line men. And you could see as the ACE score goes up, so does the incidence of depression. We know that ACEs are held in the body. Dr. Besser van der Kolk wrote this marvelous book with the title, The Body Keeps the Score. Even if we don't have a conscious memory of negative childhood experiences, those memories are held in our body and our body reacts. So those ACEs being held in the body leads to medical, mental, physical, behavioral health problems that follow us right into adulthood. And sometimes we intentionally hand those down to the next generation through the behaviors that we've learned, that way we react. So becoming an alcoholic, marrying an alcoholic, suffering from depression are part of the intergenerational transmission of adverse childhood experiences. So here we see a list of some of the health and societal problems that this study was able to clearly document. We want to say that this doesn't show a causal effect. They're not saying specifically that ACEs cause these diseases, but there is definitely a correlation between adverse childhood experiences and having these concerns. Because of this, the ACE researchers concluded that ACEs are the leading cause of health and social problems in our nation. And that should lead us thinking about, how do we prevent ACEs? How do we bring these scores down? We're living in a time for such stunning potential to be able to shift the trajectory of people's lives and society in general, if we start paying more attention to these adverse childhood experiences and what they mean. We know that ACEs are common and they're highly interrelated, and there's a cumulative effect that's captured by the ACE score. People with higher ACE scores are more likely to have multiple health and social problems, some of which increase the odds of their children also having higher ACE scores. The discoveries about the effects of toxic stress on the developing brain provide a biologic plausibility for the ACE study findings. This information makes a really strong case for concluding that the relationship between the ACE scores and health problems is a cause and effect relationship. So how do we put all this together to make a case for understanding ACEs as an important and powerful pathway for understanding, well-being in our society? So the ACE study team and the ACE interface believe that preventing ACEs and their intergenerational transmission is the greatest opportunity of our time for improving the well-being of human populations. That's a pretty bold statement. The most important thing we can do for the well-being of human populations is paying attention to this. So here you see this titled Population Attributable Risk. Okay, so with all of these conditions that are named here, adverse childhood experiences are a factor, but they're not the only factor. But what we see with what I kind of call the puddle in the middle is their best estimates at how much trauma is a factor in these diseases. So starting up near the top, of all cases of cancer, about 24% cases of cancer they believe can be attributed to adverse childhood experiences. You see some of these even have much higher rates, that about 65% of incidents of alcoholism can be directly linked to adverse childhood experiences. You can follow all along there. We see high risk for HIV, a very large percentage. So if we could cut cancer rates by 24%, by paying attention to this, is it something we need to do? Even workplace injuries, drinking and driving, falls that require 3 or more falls that require treatment in 90 days. How many of these things could we have an impact if we were paying more attention to ACEs? So where do we go with this? You know, the ACE study provides us really straightforward information about the consequences of adverse childhood experiences. And, you know, gives us a platform to work from and knowing how do we improve people's situations. It's powerful information we can use every day to improve health, safety, prosperity, longevity. But it's not really a roadmap. You know, it provides us an invitation to figure this out, to think about how do we make a difference for people. It's just really so important that we need to get busy with it, not just sit back until somebody figures out all of those steps, but we can think about what can we do now. And that is a part of what we do in Partners in Prevention, in trying to provide people with information and resources that they can take a look at, understanding their own situations and how do they make changes in their lives for the better. So we know there are these 3 core protective systems. You know, it's important that we're thinking about resilience as well when we're talking about the ACE study. It's so important for us to think about, you know, we can make a difference. What we do to support each other matters. You know, our desire for resilience leads naturally to searching for ways to help support families and communities. So these 3 protective systems that interact and guide positive adaptation. These systems are individual capabilities, attachment and belonging with a caring and competent person, and protective community, faith, and cultural processes. So we're going to look at each of those briefly, individually. You know, what do we know about people who do well despite adversity in their life? We know that they have these 3 protective systems and they're kind of nested together. People do best when they're living in thriving families and communities, and we can help each other develop personal attributes that help them weather life's storms. We will all have challenges. So how do we help each other have the tools that we need to be able to manage those well? So self-efficacy and self-regulation are all important as we're thinking about resilience. You know, having a positive view of ourselves lets me know I'm important and I'm valuable. You know, I'm worth taking care of. One of our stated values at Partners in Prevention is promoting the importance of self-care. When you have a positive view of yourself, it lets you ask for help when you need it. think that's something in our community we're not particularly good at. That's a thing that we can promote. When people have a positive view, you know, they have some hope. They know that social and emotional support is there, and they're more likely to take advantage of it. They're less likely to be depressed. They're more likely to be employed. So we're looking at individual capabilities that are associated with recovery and resilience are often the very same capabilities that people don't develop when they've experienced these negative childhood situations and this toxic stress. Some people have an attitude of, you know, people just tried harder. They could do better. But sometimes it's our biologic adaptations that keep us from taking advantage of those situations, from knowing that they're available, for believing that we even deserve that kind of support. We really have to be intentional about supporting development of this positive view in ourselves and others, for children, but adults as well. So we know that sense of belonging, that's one of our really basic human needs. So that's the second part of this protective system. How do we nurture belonging? Now, how do we help people feel connected? How do we help them be part of something? It's relationships, not just with caring people, but competent people. People that have some skills to help and support. And we can all learn those skills so that we're in a better position to support each other. It's about practicing safety in all forms. It's about noticing when someone needs some support and knowing how to offer that. People can often have difficulty with emotional regulation, for being able to read social cues and knowing how to respond appropriately. Having problems with addiction, you know, broken family relationships. Those can be challenging, not only to the person who's experiencing, but to the people around them. So learning those skills, learning how to build those relationships, how to support each other in a positive way is a really important thing we can do. And then looking at the bigger community, you know, if we really want to dramatically improve the health and safety of all of us and for future generations, we have to think about how do we build this in our community? How do we have a community that's strong and thriving? It's about empowerment. It's about investing in people who have the most at stake. You know, how do we learn from the people who have these experiences? To not view them as somebody who is in need of services or is in need of somebody doing something for them, but see them as the experts in knowing what they need and working alongside people to help educate all of us about what would be most useful. So building community capacity is about helping people learn and manage and improve whatever their internal needs are. And they are the best ones to tell us about that. How do we think about being flexible with funding? How many times have you heard stories of people who are trying to get help and support for something, and perhaps the services they need are there, but the funding says, but not for you? Or that we have educational systems who, you know, bless our teachers and our educators, but kids have a lot of different needs. And how do you meet the needs of all those different kids in a classroom? It's not that easy. You know, we have to look at how do public and private funders work together to make sure we're providing programs, training, education in a way that helps us all know how to do better. You know, we're not there yet, but we're working on that. And I think we're becoming more aware of that importance of working together and recognizing people as individuals with things to give, to share, with gifts, and not just people with deficits. So, you know, there's kind of a pattern to transformative change in a community. You know, it begins with things like this, learning about the basics, being willing to have those conversations, having each of us look at, what do I think about this? And what can I do? How can I think about situations and people in a different way? How do we develop new habits? How do we perhaps change some of the things that we're doing in our daily lives? You know, these community change doesn't happen in the broad range. It starts with each one of us thinking about what can I do as an individual? How do I interact with people? How do I support people? The truth is that, you know, people will create a new reality long before there are laws or policies. You know, it starts with individuals. So some communities have really dug into how do we do this collectively, very consciously focused on thinking about this. There's a small group of people that work here in our community on an ongoing basis, looking at this, looking at supporting each other as we do our work in a stronger way, making sure we're communicating a consistent message across different programs and with different populations of people. And, you know, it's not our goal to get to 0 ACE scores. That's not realistic. You know, people will experience challenges. We do want to bring those scores down. We want to work at it from both ends. You know, we are partners in prevention. We want to look at how do we give people the skills and the tools that they need so they can live their best lives. Many other organizations and agencies are working at how do you support people so that they can make good, healthy choices for themselves, that they have the opportunities to make those choices. So we will never get to 0 ACE scores, but we can lower those scores. And in the meantime, we can do a lot to support people to know how do you heal. For example, a couple of the programs we do, caring for children who've experienced trauma. We do a 6-week course that helps adults know if I have a child in my life that has had a lot of these negative experiences, how do I best support them? What is it they need from me? And 6 weeks is quite a commitment. It could be much longer than that even, but we help people really examine and think very specifically about their own child that they care about and what they can do differently to help and support. And in doing that, we had adults say, what about me? And so we developed a course for adults as well, for them to think about how their childhood experiences have impacted their behaviors, their patterns of thinking, their habits that they've developed, to be able to understand, oh, this is why I do this. And I have a choice about this. I have these behaviors that don't serve me well. I can make a difference in that. But it's all of us collectively thinking about what else can we do. Those are just a couple of examples of, you know, what might be available in a community. It's about thinking about people in a different way, understanding where they came from, recognizing that some of the negative behaviors we're seeing aren't just conscious choices to be difficult, but they're things they've learned. They've learned to be in survival mode, in protection mode, to always be on the lookout for what next bad thing is going to happen to me. They have a much different approach to things than people who, you know, expect the positive, who see the good, who generally good things happen and they recognize and they respond in that way appropriately. So it really is about us. It's about family. It's about community. It's about kids. You know, it's our action to prevent ACEs and how we can profoundly move that ahead for the future. So any thoughts you would like to share, questions? I know we have
a
out
microphone we
of
can
time.
move about, both here and here. One of the things, Mary, I'm curious about is how do I identify those adverse experiences? I mean, you might see kids in class or in the neighborhood having behavioral issues, but you don't necessarily know what goes on in their own lives. How do you identify that and say, this experience caused this behavior? Is it that simple or?
Well, and there's lots of overlaps too, right? There are lots of things that can cause negative behaviors. But it is, if you know that individual, if you have an opportunity to understand, you know, something about their history. In some cases, it's not as important to know the cause. It's important to say there's a reason why this person behaves this way, whether it is trauma, whether it's something else. And it's about, allowing people to share who they are in a way that you can understand better and have that more positive expectation that this person isn't just doing this because they want to make other people miserable. That perhaps there's a reason why they learned these patterns of behavior. Or perhaps they have learned not to trust other people. They've learned to expect that people are going to let them down. They've learned to know that if somebody's going to take care of me, it has to be me by whatever means possible. So sometimes it is getting to know that individual and understanding their history and understanding where that came from. It's not something that we can just kind of look at someone and make a judgment about. It's not about diagnosing someone. It's really about understanding, looking at them with compassion. And if we're going to help connect them to resources for healing, that's when it becomes important to know what's the origin of this. Is it from those negative childhood experiences, or is it from something else? Does that help? Ask me more. Let's continue that conversation, because it is an important conversation.
It's a start, and I don't know how to go about moving people closer to finding those answers to be able to begin the process of the healing, as you call it. I guess another question I have too is, do you see variations in families as to responding to those various experiences? If someone is moving in a military family across the country 7 times, parts of those families do very well and sometimes they don't. Other types of problems bring out different strengths and different family members. How do you capitalize on those strengths?
And what the research tells us is that one of the very key elements is supportive adults. Somebody there who can help you make sense of what's happening, that they can lessen those negative effects. If you have an ability to express how you're feeling about something, and somebody can help you, manage those emotions, understand those feelings, that's huge. That cumulative effect is so important. You're moving multiple times, but is that, I don't say only in terms of minimizing that, but are there additional stresses as well? You think about how difficult that is for a child. I'm fortunate. I attended the same school system my entire life. But for children who have to move, they have to accommodate making new friendships. When you think about just the transition from one classroom to another, and you have to adapt to, how does that teacher interact with people? That's manageable. But if you're having to adapt to a new community and how things work, where things are located, how do I find my way around a new home? And where are things and how do they work and what are the rules? And a new school and making new friends. And you can see that cumulative effect is huge. And if there isn't an adult there to help you manage and understand and help you have those skills that you need, it becomes extremely difficult. And part of it is temperament. Some people just grow up, they just are born, they are easier to roll with punches. We all have some level of resilience that we're born with. We can increase that. We can learn those skills to be more resilient. Some kids they just roll with it. Some of us need to learn how to do that. So there's just so many different elements. And that's what I find interesting about the neuroscience. It's about the neurobiology. It's about epigenetics. It's about adverse childhood experiences, and it's about resilience altogether.
Another time I saw one of these presentations about ACEs, there was a listing of quite a large number of experiences that can be considered adverse or negative.
Yes.
Does it help someone working with kids to know all of those things on a list? Because I was surprised in reading that list a few years ago that I looked at them and thought, that shouldn't be a big deal, this experience or that experience. But knowing that it can change a child's life opened my eyes, I have to say, as far as responding to kids in general and adults.
And I'm glad you brought that up because the ACE study looked at these 10 categories of ACEs. That doesn't mean they're the only ones. There certainly are others. That's just this particular study. This is what they looked at. But we know that situational, growing up in poverty, I'm fortunate that I have experienced very little discrimination in my lifetime. It's been there, but it didn't affect me in a way that every day I had to look in the world in a way and have that fear of being judged or being mistreated or being not trusted. So, there's so many additional things that can play a role in that too.
Well, my concern would be in terms of educating the public, all of us in this room and other groups that you see, is how to list those kinds of things so people can read them and think, oh, maybe that did affect me or my neighbor or someone in the family differently than I would have expected. How do you put that information out there for people to think about those experiences and how they might affect people? This was kind of a general overview, but how do we get to those specifics being in the public eye?
And we want to be careful with lists because they will never contain everything. And we don't want to use them as a checklist and say, oh, well, I only had one ACE, so that's not so bad as somebody who's had 4. But perhaps that one ACE was a chronic situation with very severe consequences. So it doesn't become I had it worse than you, or it wasn't so bad. We had an interesting conversation in our last series where we were talking with adults about their own experiences and how that's impacted them. And a conversation about how a family expresses care and love. And, a couple of people were talking about the fact that they felt loved and cared for, but their family didn't hug a lot. They weren't verbal in saying on a regular basis, I love you, but they didn't feel unloved. And from another person, their perspective was, well, that was neglect. If you weren't regularly told you were loved and hugged, you should have been. Okay, it's perspective. So with all of this information, again, the ACE study is a study across the population. We can take the information and apply it to individuals, but we need to have some caution about that too. We also know that this ACE score doesn't determine your destiny. We know in a population, the higher your ACE score, the more likely you're going to have these negative consequences, but it's not a guarantee. So again, it's about what kind of supports someone has. What kind of resilience do they have? What kind of tools do they have to understand this is what happened and this is how it's impacting my thinking? We talk a lot in our trainings about how we have in the neighborhood of 60 to 70,000 thoughts a day. About 80% of those are negative. And about 90% of them or 95% repeat. And so we have this negative self-talk going on all the time. Things we would never say out loud to someone else, we're saying to ourselves in our thoughts. And so, that even that is one thing that we can do to catch those negative thoughts. Call attention to them, to say that's not true. Our thoughts are very real, but that doesn't mean they're true. That's a simple thing that each of us can do individually. Most people have never thought about that concept. Once you pay attention to it, you go, oh yeah, I really do. I'm quite often every day say these negative things to myself.
Okay. Well, any other questions for Mary?
You can see this conversation could go on for a very long time.
I had a chat with the public school nurse now recently. And I told her what we're about a little bit. And I asked, how much of this do you kind of see with some of these things that you treat? And she says, a lot. She says the straightforward case of somebody trips and takes all the skin off their shin and needs some attention. Those are the few and far between that are uncomplicated issues. Often by the time she sees a physical manifestation, and they do have a physical manifestation, there is something wrong, there's something behind that. And those are the people that kind of have to get to it in terms of, you know, to identify, yeah, the teachers and caregivers and some folks like that. Getting it out of the general population, I think is a hard thing to do, because people are not tuned into it. I mean, this is not, ACEs are not something that affects 80% of the population. It's a small percentage. And so it's hard to get that message out because you don't see it.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I would challenge that statement in a little bit in saying, you know, about a third of the population has an ACE score of 0, but people around them don't all have an ACE score of 0. So we're probably all affected by this, even if our score is very low. You know, we're dealing with, you know, other family members or coworkers or, you know, extended family, friends that are impacted, and that, you know, with some compassion, we can be a little more empathetic and help them perhaps see, you know, if this is something that's not serving you well, would you be interested in changing it? You know, you have this long-standing habit or pattern of behavior, and it's getting in the way. And if we can understand it, you know, we can, and it takes time, right? We've learned habits over a lifetime. We're not going to learn to do something new and change it in a week or two. It takes being very aware of it and taking very conscious steps, you know, to do something differently. But you think about, you know, our court systems. This isn't like, okay, everybody has an excuse. Nobody has to be held accountable because things were rough. That's not what we're talking about, but we're helping understand, you know, what brought someone here. If we don't want somebody to come into the court system again, how do we help them understand how they got here so they can make changes? With those people who have some chronic health problems that maybe are hard to explain. We don't, you know, it's hard to find a cause. Is this a piece of it? You know, it's like, how do we just think about it as a factor, not that it's the answer to everything, but it's an opportunity for us to think about, is it a factor in whatever challenge somebody's experiencing?
Right, I've been to a few of these things of late, you know, and one of the things that you folks put up right up front is the self-care issue. And the reactions I get from the program participants are like, they kind of perk their ears up frequently. Some of them really tune into it, but no one dismisses that out of hand.
Mm-hmm.
And it's presented fairly simply. It's like, do something for yourself every day for a little bit and don't feel guilty about it, you know? And a lot of times you just can't. We've been working and parenting and being a spouse and stuff. You can't get to that sometimes, but it can be quite important. I think that's the adaptation that needs to be going on sometimes.
And it can be, and we promote things that don't add to your to-do list. You know, what's the simple thing you can do that you can do in a couple of minutes or while you're waiting? I was thinking about this because I think about this stuff a lot while I'm brushing my teeth. It's like, hey, while I'm brushing my teeth, it's something I do every day. What can I be, you know, can I improve my positive self-talk at that point? Can I spend that time thinking about what I'm grateful for? Can I spend that time thinking about what can I do today that's going to brighten somebody else's day or brighten my day? So it's like, how do you just incorporate it right into what you're doing anyway? And much of it is about our thoughts and in making sure we're inserting those positives. Anything else?
Any questions from the Zoom viewers? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mary. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's such an important topic for us to be thinking about. How do we make a difference?
Thank you.